Thank you, Rich, and I'm happy to report we completed this spelling bee this morning. It's good to have a wife who knows how to spell. Never my forte. Now, it's certainly a beautiful day today and a great day to talk about the Watchung Reservation. So let me introduce our speaker. We can open this up. It's my pleasure to welcome Dan Bernier back to the Seminole Guard for its third presentation. Many of you will remember Dan from his previous fascinating talks about the Deserted Village, a subject he knows intimately as its resident caretaker and the driving force behind its restoration. Today, Dan will broaden our perspective, taking us on a virtual journey along the 6-mile Watchung Reservation History Trail. Dan brings with him a wealth of experience and dedication to our community, a graduate of Seton Hall University with a Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology, specializing in North American archaeology. Dan has served Union County since 1982 in a variety of roles within the Department of Parks and Recreation. Currently, as director of the Division of Park Environmental Services, Dan oversees all wildlife programs for the county, including the pioneering Watchung Reservation Deer Management Program, which he designed and administered, which was the first of its kind in New Jersey. Dan's commitment to historic preservation is equally impressive. Over the past 36 years, he has supervised the restoration of the deserted village of Feltville, securing 4 New Jersey historic preservation grants totaling $1.1 million. His efforts have stabilized and restored key historic buildings, including the church, general store, and Masker's barn, transforming them into vibrant community spaces. Please join me in welcoming Dan Bernier to the podium.
Okay, good morning. I'd like to thank you for having me back to speak this morning. We are going to go in a slightly different direction than we did before by talking about the Watchung Reservation History Trail. I'm sure that over time, many of you have been in the Watchung Reservation. Just a show of hands, how many of you feel somewhat familiar with the Watchung Reservation? Quite a few. You all live in close proximity. I just want to give you a quick geography lesson to help better understand some of the events that have taken place there. The Watchung Reservation is 3.2 square miles, basically 2,100 acres, that spans 2 of the 3 Watchung ridges. The first Watchung Mountain runs through Springfield, Mountainside, Scotch Plains. The second Watchung Ridge is Summit, New Providence, Berkeley Heights. So you've got these 2 mountain ridges with a valley between them, which is traversed by the Blue Brook, which is dammed up in a couple of locations, forming Lake Surprise, and then further down after the Blue Brook becomes a Green Brook, it forms Seeley's Pond. So with that in mind, we're going to talk about things that that you will better understand by understanding how we've got that low-lying valley between these 2 mountains. In, I believe it was 2011, I was approached by an Eagle Scout candidate who had an idea for creating a trail in the Watchung Reservation that would highlight historical points. In the Watchung Reservation, we have probably close to 100 miles of hiking trails. You could hike for a long time and not see it all. Not all of those trails are marked. The most significant marked trail is the Sierra Trail, which is a 10-mile loop that pretty much encircles the entire park. It's a great hike. It's got a lot of challenging terrain, interesting sights, but it's 10 miles. You need a whole day to commit to doing that trail. We have several small trails, particularly adjacent to the Trailside Nature and Science Center that are typically only a quarter of a mile or a half a mile long, that are regularly used by Trailside itself when they take out school groups, or by families, people who are walking their dogs, people who want to take a marked route so they're sure to get into and back out of the woods, but not wanting to go a long distance. Well, the Eagle Scout candidate, Robert Gruich, a young man, he was probably 16 at the time, from Roselle Park, was looking to lay out a trail that would be a little more moderate in scope, that would be more of a hike, but wouldn't take the whole day commitment like the Sierra Trail did. And again, the key basis behind it would be that it would visit sites of interest that have history behind them. So today, we're going to take a hike. We're literally going to walk the 6 miles from our seats. I'm going to take you to each of the sites, and we will talk about what is highlighted at each of those sites. The trail is laid out as a loop. In fact, I'll go back for 1 second to the map. On the map, you will see the trail as the pink or purple route. It is marked with pink blazes on trees throughout the park, and it is in the central portion of the park. So it is laid out that you can start from more than one location. It begins, the series of sites in terms of numbering begins at the Trailside Nature and Science Center, but you could instead start at the parking lot at the Deserted Village of Feltville. That is another very popular place for people to park and go off to hike. You'll be starting in the middle of the series, but it really doesn't matter where you start. You'll understand all the sites as you go. There is a printed map and brochure that explains all of these sites as you go. I have a number of them here today. They'll be available on a table in the back when you go, as well as a booklet about the Deserted Village of Feltville and a booklet about historic sites throughout Union County. If you want to help yourself to any of it, it'll be out there for your taking on the way out. So the first site is the Trailside Nature and Science Center. This is a picture of the visitor center, which was constructed in 1975 and expanded in 2006. Trailside has a very interesting history in that back in 1941, a woman by the name of Margaret Rulison approached what was then the Union County Park Commission and said, you know, people seem to have an interest in things related to nature. Could I set up a little display somewhere? Well, they had a garage that had just been built 6 years before. It had been built to serve as the garage for the horticulture crew that would take care of a nursery that existed in the Watchung Reservation at that time, where they grew plant stock that would be reused at locations throughout the park system as they were doing landscaping projects. And they told Margaret she could have a card table in the corner of the garage to set up her display. So she laid out some pine cones and acorns and some labels and explained things. And apparently the interest was so great that a year later, just a year later, they turned over this building, which is now only 7 years old, gave the whole building to her to convert into a nature museum. The museum was set up according to a National Park Service model for trailside museums. That was the name of this model that the Park Service had created. As far as we know, the Trailside Museum in the Watchung Reservation is the oldest remaining trailside museum in the United States. Over time, the exhibits grew. There were, if like me, you were there in your youth, you saw all these different displays of plants and animals. These were animal tracks that were outside, which we again have thanks to another Eagle Scout candidate who recreated our animal track trail for us. the place has always been an opportunity to come face to face with the wildlife of the Watchung Reservation. The trail side was lucky to get a lot of exhibits donated by the Museum of Natural History in New York City. So if you went in there when you were younger and saw these big glass cases with a condor, an American eagle, or a fox in it, that's where those came from. In the 1960s, the interests of people started to expand beyond just the natural world of the Watchung Reservation. And thanks to the director at that time, Don Meyer, who's here on the right-hand side of the picture, they started looking out towards space. And they constructed another building alongside of the museum building and built it as a planetarium. That planetarium operated up until probably the early 1990s, mid-1990s, and shut down only because of the difficulty of finding somebody to staff it. It's not a topic that a lot of people get involved in. There is a plan now to construct a new planetarium at the Trailside Nature and Science Center. In 1975, I showed you in that initial picture, the visitor center moved, let me just see. Yeah, I don't have a picture of the original building, but the original wooden garage was supplanted by a cinder block and glass building that was designed by the famous architect Michael Graves. It was expanded 2006, I believe. This large section over here was added, which actually tripled the size of the building, adding a number of classrooms, which were essential to the mission that Trailside does there. And now a planetarium will be constructed out here on the left-hand side, which is the part of the building that you first approach as you come from the parking lot. And the plan is to have a huge dome constructed right there. And the planetarium will be inside that dome. You'll go sit inside of it and see celestial things projected onto the ceiling above you. Again, great place to learn about nature, meet wildlife right up close. And there are a lot of programs for school classes. There are programs for children coming after school. And on the weekends, there are programs for scout groups. There are programs for adults. There is a special series for senior citizens, nature hikes that are geared towards learning, but over a shorter walk for those of us who may be a little more challenged at that point in our lives. In the expanded visitor center, there is a 3-story tall beech tree rather, that grows right up through the center of the building artificially. And it has at the base of it a running stream that terminates in a little pond, and kids can actually look into the pond and see turtles and fish living inside of it. Okay, moving on to our next site. This is the copper mine. The copper mine is one of those kind of elusive type of sites that everybody's heard of it, but nobody's ever seen it. As you hike the trail, you will find a sign at that point that you will know you were looking down into this ravine to the site of what was a copper mine. The history of it is not well documented, but what we believe to know from what little we do have is that the mine was first opened during the Revolutionary War, that a vein of copper ore had been found along this ravine, a cut in the mountain that led down to the Blue Brook. And there was a desire to be able to harvest that copper ore to make copper that would be contributing to the war effort for making munitions. Apparently, the labor force for doing that was captured Hessian soldiers who were being held somewhere nearby. The work was very difficult. The location is extremely impractical for hauling large amounts of ore out of because it's in this deep ravine. So best as we can tell, the mine was only exploratory. It went into the mountain just 10 or 15 feet. In the more recent years, when the property came into possession of the Park Commission, it became a popular place for kids to gather. Here we see some kids having a campfire right at the base of the mine opening, and some concern grew that this could be an attractive nuisance. You know, what if there was ever a collapse? So I don't know that it was purposely filled in, but I think that it kind of filled in on its own as kids scrambled up and around it on the higher portions of the mountain. So today it is extremely difficult to see it. This is the sign that tells us about the mine, and the mine is down there on the other side of the ravine. But even if you went down there, it would be kind of difficult for you to discern today. This sign is typical of the signs that you will find if you actually do come out one day to hike the trail. There is a sign like this on a post at every one of the sites that has a little less of the history than I'm able to give you today, but generally a picture that helps you to better understand what occurred at that site. Moving on to our next site. The next site we get to is down along the Blue Brook in the valley below the second Watchung Mountain. And up on top of that mountain is the Deserted Village of Feltville, which we'll talk a little bit more further on when we get to that site. But down on the floodplain of the Blue Brook was a large flat area where in 1845, David Felt built a factory for his business, which was called Stationers Hall Press, which was the driving force behind the whole formation of the mill town of Feltville, which we now know today as the Deserted Village. Building mills along the Blue Brook was not something new. Peter Wilcox had done it back in 1736, a little further upstream, and he had a low dam, only 5 foot high. That's all that he needed to drive a sawmill. In 1736, this area was the frontier of America, and Peter knew that people would be moving into the area to build farms and farmhouses and eventually churches and mercantile buildings and things of that type. So he and his sons built a dam, a sawmill, and started to cut down the trees from the forest to produce lumber that he was then able to sell. And of course, by cutting down the trees, he also cleared a lot of the land, so they became farmers as well. It was over 100 years later that David Felt bought property from the descendants of the Wilcoxes to build his mill town of Feltville. And again, the whole industry was centered around his factory, which we see in this picture. It's a 3.5-story building, 150 feet long. It is basically outfitted with machinery that will make stationary products, things that businesses would need to operate, basically related to paper and pens or pencils. So this building was primarily a printing factory. They printed things like receipt books and ledger pads. They also had the ability in this building to make marbleized end papers, which are those fancy multicolored pages you see at the front and back of old books. The mill operated for 15 years while Feltville was in operation. In 1860, when there we go. In 1860, when David Felt left the Deserted Village, well, Feltville, and sold the property ended up changing hands 6 times over the next 22 years, 6 different businesses that were tried and failed. And as each business failed and went away, so too did some of the people. David Felt had 175 people living in his mill town. By 1882, that was down to 0. and hence the nickname Deserted Village. In that 22-year period, this mill saw a variety of lives. It was no longer a printing business. One of the businesses that was tried was manufacturing sarsaparilla, which is a drink somewhat akin to birch beer. So they were bottling that product here in this building. Somebody else was trying to use David Felt's 600 acres of farm fields to grow tobacco, and they were rolling cigars down here in the factory. In 1882, Warren Ackerman came along. He was a wealthy landowner from Scotch Plains. He had purchased up much of the Feltville property at public auction. He had an interest in raising fancy cattle and was going to use the farm fields as the grazing land, and he used this building as his stable. Kind of a messy and smelly end to a rather important edifice of manufacturing. But he did that initially, but then veered off into running a resort, which we'll talk about later. So this is the building as we see it in 1929. By that point, you can see that it's vacant. The doors are open. Some of the windows are missing. And this back portion of the building, which touches the mountain right here, it is somewhere right along here that the water that drove the machinery would have come through a race, a channel, and over a water wheel at the back of the building. But it would seem that Warren Ackerman, when he constructed this road here to get his cattle up and down to his stable, somewhat obliterated the water wheel, so we have no evidence of that today. So in 1930, the Union County Park Commission tore down this mill because by that time they regarded it as an attractive nuisance, and they feared kids getting hurt in there. Okay, on to our next stop. We are coming back up and around to the Deserted Village through what would today be considered the back way, but back in the 1840s, 1850s was actually the way most people approached the Deserted Village. They came in off of the road through the valley of the Blue Brook, which still exists today out in Watchung as Valley Road, and then exists in the Watchung Reservation as a what we call the carriage road down along the Blue Brook, until it gets to an area that has been flooded out so often that it is no longer recognizable. But that would have brought you to the mill, and from there is an offshoot that comes up to an area in the woods where we find this little pond. This is a pond which growing up I was told was called Salamander Pond. A very nice freshwater pond. There's the sign looking down into it. There, off to the side here, behind these bushes, there is a brick arch that covers a spring where water comes out the side of the mountain and fills this pond. Well, obviously, there had to be a reason for building the pond. The reason was to create a water source for the resort that we're going to talk about in a little bit that Warren Ackerman had created. So the spring is over here. There's a little dam over here that makes this small pond. It's maybe a third the size of this room when it doesn't have all of this weedy type vegetation around it. You can actually see that there's a stone wall around it with a stone dam at this end. And it was built to supply water for the houses in the summer resort, because it was at that time that indoor plumbing was added to the houses in which David Felt had formerly housed his mill workers. Indoor plumbing meant you didn't have to have outhouses anymore. And it also meant you had running water, that people didn't have to go out to a well to fetch water for cooking or drinking. And because of the availability of this water and because of the nature of the summer resort that Ackerman was operating, he built a little brick building to the side over here, and in it was a steam-driven pump. That steam-driven pump would pump this water up to an underground reservoir that sat just above the former farm fields, and the water could then flow back by gravity to the houses. Since he had this steam-driven pump, that meant he also had steam, so he was able to operate a steam laundry at this location for the summer guests. Well, somebody had to be responsible for that. So there was a house that was constructed way out beyond the, about a quarter of a mile out beyond the limits of the former Feltville mill town. And a man lived there whose job it was to watch after the steam pump and the movement of water and the laundry. And because he lived so far out on his own, he got for himself the nickname of the Hermit. And hence the name of the pond today is Hermit's Pond. That is its more accurate name. Okay, as from that location, we actually head away from the deserted village for a short while. We head out towards the western end of the park to an area known as the Drake Farm. There are two sites there. One is at the Drake House, which no longer exists. The other is at the Drake Barn, which no longer exists, but there are at least remnants, stone remnants of the foundation there. It's a little easier to recognize. Here you see a large section of that stone wall. The Drake family farmed land in that area in what later became the western end of the Watchung Reservation. And in fact, after the land was purchased up by the Park Commission, the Drakes continued to farm it for a while, yet into the 1940s. And in fact, Charles Drake became an employee of the Park Commission and at one point a high-ranking supervisor in their maintenance department. Now we are coming back to the deserted village, which again can be a starting point for your trip if you take the hike. I'm not going to get into the whole history of the deserted village because that's a subject for a whole nother day, and it has been twice before here. But just to give you a quick overview, this is an artist's reconstruction of what the village may have looked like in its later lifetime. But I've already explained to you about how David Felt built a mill, and he had all this machinery, but he needed people to operate the machinery. So he built an entire town for those people to live in. He recruited people out of New York City, and by 1850, he had 175 people living there. He provided for them in every way necessary. Besides giving them good jobs, he made sure that everything they would need would be available to them through the general store: food, books, candles, clothing. They didn't have the ability to go out of the village. They didn't have, well, cars didn't even exist yet. They didn't all have horses and carriages. These were simple workers. And even if they did, where would they go? It's not like they could run down to the Blue Star Shopping Center because it didn't exist yet. So he built his village up on this bluff, which overlooks the Blue Brook. Here's the brook down below. David had built two dams along the Blue Brook. One was upstream, it's out of our view here, upstream from where the Wilcox Mill had been 100 years before, and then the other was right here. This would feed water through this raceway, the channel I told you about, that brings the water to the mill to operate the machinery, and then the water went through what's called the tail race along the road and then back into the Blue Brook further down. Why did he have two lakes? Wouldn't one be enough? Well, the one lake provided plenty of water as long as rain was consistent. But if you got into a period of drought and you started to lose elevation of the water in your lake, then the water could no longer get out into that channel and your machinery would be shut down and people would have no work to do. So he had a second lake that was further upstream that in those periods of drought, he could release water from that lake down to the primary lake and keep his business going. That upper lake, of course, was named Feltville Lake, named it after himself. Keep that in mind. We'll talk about that again later. Up here, he built houses along these two streets. He had a building here, which was his office that he first worked from as he built his town. He built an entire town of about 24 buildings in 2 years. That building still exists today. It's where I live. Right next door is this building, which is the general store downstairs and the church upstairs. Besides taking care of their physical needs, David Felt made sure to take care of the spiritual needs of his employees. He was a Unitarian. He believed that everybody should live a good Christian life. So he had ministers come to the village every week. Eventually, he hired a minister named Austin Craig to be there in residence for 2 years, and he compelled all of his people to go to church services. He was a little rigid. He had a bell on a farm building that would be rung out every morning to get people up and out to work. It would ring again at the end of the day to tell them when they could go home. It even rang every night at 9 o'clock to tell them that there was a curfew and they had to be within doors. So again, he was kind of strict. People called him King David, but he did look after them. Here we see the artist's view of those houses that the people lived in. Just very simple houses with what's known as a Greek revival, vernacular Greek revival style of architecture. This was a conjectural image of David Felt's mansion. More recent archaeological work has shown that his house did stand at about this location, which is just down the street and across the street from the general store and church. But his house was really only the same size as the other houses and certainly not ornate like this is. This is how that same site looked in later years when the road had not yet been quite improved. It certainly looks a lot better today. Up at the parking lot at the top of the road just off of Glenside Avenue, you will find the sign for the history trail that gives a very brief history, and it's attached to this informational kiosk where we have these boxes where you could pick up information like the printed material that's at the back of the room today, or in this modern age, there are so many other ways to get information. You can get the guided tour booklet, you can get the Watchung Reservation History Trail map off of the internet from the county's website, which is very easy to find. It's ucnj.org, Union County, New Jersey.org. Just go to under Parks Department, look for trails, and you will find all of that there. There are also QR codes available at this kiosk and elsewhere on site where you can click on and you can get the walking tour as an audio tour, and you can just listen as you walk around. You don't have to read the signs, but there are also interpretive panels as you walk around that will give you more of the history as well, and including a lot more photographs. This is a view down Cataract Hollow Road, which is the main road through the deserted village. It got its name from the fact that it went down into the hollow, the valley. That's another word for, down in the valley, at the bottom of this hill where the Blue Brook is, right across from the mill. There was this big split in the mountain, which is known today as the Glen. It kind of was like the Lover's Lane of Feltville, a very picturesque spot with ancient hemlock trees growing on either side of it. But the technical name for a split in a mountain is a cataract. So this is the road that takes you down to the hollow where you'll see the cataract, hence Cataract Hollow Road. When I first moved to the Deserted Village in 1992, my address was 1 Glenside Park. The mailing addresses were then associated with the name of the resort that came later, which was Glenside Park. At some point, I received a phone call from the 911 operator who was sitting right next to the fire chief for Berkeley Heights, and they were updating the 911 system and had realized that if there was ever a 911 call, that they would not have Glenside Park coming up on the map, because that's not the actual name of the road. So they got together with the post office, and the post office sent me a nice letter saying that as of today, your address is now 1 Cataract Hollow Road. So I had to tell everybody that I moved, even though I didn't move. And try fitting Cataract Hollow Road in those little boxes on any application. This is the building that was the general store downstairs, the church upstairs. This is how it looks after it was restored in 1998 using one of those New Jersey Historic Trust grants that was mentioned before. This building now serves as the visitor center for the village. The former general store has been outfitted with some museum exhibits. Upstairs is just an administrative and storage space. But if you go around to the back of the building, there is a basement level, which is restored as well, and that is where we have public restrooms. This would be a good point for me to interject that on the third full weekend of October in every year, the county runs a program called 4 Centuries in a Weekend. You've probably seen signs, banners hanging over Springfield Avenue. On that given weekend, all of the historic sites in Union County, right now there are 35 that participate. They all open on Saturday and Sunday, generally from noon to 5, free of charge for people to visit. Some of them, most of them, are house museums, like several that are here in New Providence and Berkeley Heights. Some of them are not historic houses, but sites that relate the history of the town. So for instance, Roselle Park, it's just a storefront, but it's their museum of the history of their town. The Deserted Village has been one of the sites in the 4 Centuries program right from the beginning, but we are the largest of the sites. Technically, the Feltville Historic District is 130 acres within the Watchung Reservation. We have, a lot of land to work with. We have 10 buildings and a lot of space between them. And I have the great advantage of having access to the whole Union County staff to be able to provide services and activities that weekend. So on that weekend, Saturday and Sunday, noon to 5, this year it's October 18th and 19th. Come, bring your family, especially bring your grandkids, because it is very family oriented, a lot of stuff for kids to do. The activities include a hayride. And in fact, for anybody who's mobility challenged, the Deserted Village can be tough to get around because it is on the side of the hill. Getting down to it is easy. Getting back up to your car, not so easy. But you can board the hayride at the parking lot, and it will take you to Masker's Barn. It'll take you to this general store, and it'll take you back to the parking lot. And you can do it in sections. You can do it all in one big trip. But it is a hayride and a means of transportation. There are old-fashioned children's games. There's an archaeological activity for children to do. There are 3 archaeologists that work with us on a regular basis, and they are often there to speak to adults while the kids are doing the archaeological activity. And adults can learn about the archaeological work that has gone on there now for several decades. Here at the general store, the store is open. You can go in and see the museum exhibits, but you can also shop in the store. We have, some retro candy and old-fashioned toys that kids can buy. On the porch, we kind of recreate the classroom of what would have been a one-room schoolhouse that stood in what is now the parking lot up at the top of the road. But the teacher of that time, Sarah Felt-Toby, is here to teach kids how to write with quill pens, and we give them little booklets that they can write in. We also, right here in this space, have a tent set up with an apple cider press. And my Boy Scout troop from Elizabeth comes and spends the weekend, and they will grind 20 bushels of apples into cider and give out free samples to the roughly 2,000 visitors who will come through that weekend. On the porch, David Felt, the man himself who built this village back in 1845, who coincidentally looks a little bit like me, he will offer armchair tours right here on the porch. What that means is he gives about a 20 to 30 minute long history of the village without having to actually walk the whole thing. But then he goes down to Masker's Barn at the end of the road and meets up with Priscilla Hayes, who is unofficially the village historian, and she will be doing a presentation. And when she finishes her presentation inside the barn, the two of them together lead a walking tour through the village back up to the general store here. That typically gets 25 to 50 people tagging along for that. There is another kiosk down there. Right alongside of that is where we do the archaeological activity, because just next to that, right off to the side of the picture here, is where David Felt's house once stood. These are just some old historical photos from back in the early days of the village, where they had cut down a tree, and you're looking at how they're using this neat old tractor to move the log around. Here is a picture from the resort era. So when David Felt retired in 1860 at the age of 67, and he sold the property off. I told you over 22 years it changed hands 6 times. But in 1882, when Warren Ackerman bought the property, he did it initially with the goal of raising those fancy cattle. But he was a millionaire. He had made a fortune in the cement business in Scotch Plains, and he made a second fortune selling vulcanized rubber to the United States Army during the Civil War. So he had all this money, and millionaires have a lot of 2 things. We all know the one thing they have a lot of is money, but the other thing they have a lot of is friends. They have friends they don't even know are their friends. Some of Warren's friends came to him and said, Warren, you know, you bought that property up there to raise cattle, but it's got all these buildings on it. You know, at that point, still about 24 buildings. Why don't you make something of that? You could, you know, like let us stay there for a week and have like a vacation spot. And of course, the buildings were much younger than they are now. They were in very good shape. And he did just that. He converted the former mill town into a summer resort. He was the one who added these ornate porches with cedar timbers that reflect the Adirondack style from up in the northern part of New York. He added these dormers up on the roof that let more light and air into the second floor so that the houses would be more livable. And he converted all of the houses into single family homes, because when they were mill workers' cottages, they typically held either 2 or 4 families per home. David Felt had 175 people. He only had 11 houses to fit them in, so they were kind of cramped. But in the resort period, you got the benefit of a whole house. You got this great porch. Usually there were multiple porches, either front and back or front and side, or in some cases, front and 2 sides. Great place to sit out in an Adirondack chair, or even better, hang up a hammock and swing out there. He built these ornate gardens. We see all this fancy landscaping work right here. Okay, I lost track of my numbers here. Where are we at? 7. Yes. So moving on from the Deserted Village. Let me just conclude by saying, as far as the Deserted Village goes, that after Warren Ackerman died in 1897, his nephews continued to run the summer resort up until 1916. Very popular place for people to go in the summer. But by then, people were buying that newfangled contraption, the automobile. And with that, they could go further away for vacation. They didn't have to go where the trains would take them. They can go where they wanted to go. So they all started going to this other new place, the Jersey Shore. And it was at that time that the mountainous resorts like Glenside Park lost favor and shut down. The Union County Park Commission was formed just a few years later in 1921. They set to work immediately buying up property to form their first 4 parks, the Watchung Reservation being one of them, which they stated from the onset would be built in the western mountainous portion of the county and would be preserved in its largely primeval state. And then that has, you know, been our Watchung Reservation ever since. In 1929, when the Great Depression hit, a lot of people were left homeless. The Park Commission started to rent out those vacant houses, and the Deserted Village has been inhabited ever since. Not so much anymore. Now it's just my family and I. But even up until when I moved in, or actually just before I moved in, there were still 5 families there. And for much of the time that I've been there, there were 3 families living there. In the 1960s, some of the houses were converted in use to classrooms for an outdoor education center, which continued up until the 1980s when the outdoor education center closed, and then those buildings stayed vacant after that. Okay, as we have become more aware of the history of the Deserted Village, the county moved to get it listed on the state and national registers of historic places in 1980. In 1985, just after I started as a planner in the Parks Department, we drafted a master plan for the Deserted Village. That plan would take 10 years and cost $3 million in 1985. Here in 2025, we are now in year 4 of that plan. We have spent $6.5 million. And I estimate we have about $4 million to go, but we have made great progress in restoring the church and general store building, restoring Masker's Barn, which you didn't get to see in the picture, but is a carriage house from the resort era that has been fully restored and is now available for rental for events, parties, birthday parties, weddings, baby showers. We do about 100 events a year there. We would do way more if my calendar allowed for it. We turn down people about 3 or 4 per day who are looking for dates that we just don't have available. 2025 is completely booked. 2026 is about 60% full at this point, and we're about to open up dates in 2027. Okay, as we move eastward from the Deserted Village, we come to the old Scout Camporee Field. In 1918, the Boy Scouts of America was still in its infancy. It had just been formed in 1910. And in 1918, a local scout council was formed in Elizabeth called the Elizabeth Area Council, Boy Scouts of America. And when 3 years later, the Park Commission was formed, there was this realization that there could be a great synergy between the Boy Scouting program and what the Park Commission was doing. And not so coincidentally, there were 2 key figures who had roles in both of those organizations. One was Walter Richmond Tracy, W.R. Tracy Drive. All of you have probably driven on that. He was the secretary engineer of the Park Commission for many of its formative years. And Colonel Lyman Parks became the first chief of the Park Police. Both of them also had key roles in the Boy Scouting organization. So when the Boy Scouts in Elizabeth was formed, they started on Fridays. They would round up all the scouts, put them in the back of trucks, and drive them up to the Watchung Reservation where they could then camp for the weekend. And they established a scout camping area. They, over time, actually built a large building to be their dining hall or mess hall. And there was a large field for tent camping. Into the 1960s, there were some lean-to structures built for the scouts to use as well. But in the 1980s, the state and federal government built a new highway through the Watchung Reservation called Interstate Route 78. And it was located very close to that Scout Camporee Field, and it was kind of felt that that was going to be not a great location to camp anymore. So as part of the highway construction, the state provided funds to construct a new scout camping area on the other side of the park behind what is now the Trailside Nature and Science Center. So that is where the scout camping functions exist today. And in fact, thanks to that money that was available, the scout camping area in the Watchung Reservation is probably the best scout camping area of any county park system in New Jersey today. But back in the earlier years, it was just mostly this big open field and the mess hall, as I said. When the scouts would stay here for the weekend, they would not only do nature study and learning scout craft, fire building and knot tying and first aid and things like that, but they also did community service. They went out on the trails. They picked up litter behind people who weren't, careful about what they did with their stuff. And very importantly, the county park police was not formed when the Park Commission was formed. It was a few years later when that happened. So the Boy Scouts were the first park police. They took care of not police functions so much, but helping lost hikers and things of that type. Okay, we now find our way down to Lake Surprise. Here is the sign at Lake Surprise. People in the past out skating on the lake. And this is a very important picture. So in 1921, when the Park Commission acquired the property, they found on it this very large lake. The lake had originally been called Feltville Lake. It was that lake that I told you that David Felt built as his emergency plan in case of drought. When Warren Ackerman bought the property, he renamed it Ackerman Lake. Sometime prior to 1921, it became known instead as Silver Lake. So the Park Commission bought Silver Lake, and it became a very popular place for aquatic activities. So here we see one of those days where the lake is just full of people swimming and boating. They thought that, gee, this is going to be a very important feature in our new park. So they had the park planners lay out a road that would get you down to the lake. And they were so clever in the way that they laid this road out that it took you down to the lake, but the forest hid the lake until you were right there. You pulled out and all of a sudden there's this lake. It came as somewhat of a surprise, hence the name Lake Surprise. As we come around the lake, we come to the site of what had been a cabin on a bluff overlooking the lake. This was a cabin built and reserved for the use of the Girl Scouts. Really nice looking log cabin. Had a campfire out front on the lake side of it. W.R. Tracy Drive is running kind of up behind it here. If you drive along Tracy Drive today and you're real observant, you'll see two poles, two old like utility poles sticking out of the ground. That was the original driveway that took you into this cabin. Back in 1975, the cabin burned to the ground of unknown reasons, probably somebody not being careful, having left a fire in the building, but it was never determined what was the cause of that, and it was never rebuilt. As we move further along the south shore of the lake, we get to the site of what had been the Lake Surprise Boathouse. There's the sign. Unfortunately, today, most all you're going to see is the sign and a little bit of stonework that was the foundation of a building, but it was a rather sizable building. I still remember it from my youth, and that trail today just runs right along here. This is all grown over in forest, and there's a lot of shrubbery along the shoreline, so you don't see this stone bulwark anymore. But they actually had all these docks with all these boats that you could go down to the boathouse and rent a boat and go out on the lake. Okay, and you can see how popular that was. Now, what if I want to get into the lake? Then let's go just a little bit further to the bathhouse. There actually was a bathing beach at Lake Surprise and a bathhouse where you could change. And here we see the stonework from the foundation of that, which will be right behind the sign when you're looking at it. And you could change there to go out to swim. Unfortunately, today, that's about all that's left of our bathing beach. Okay, we are now heading back up very close to the Trailside Nature and Science Center. We have just 2 stops left. This is the site of the Badgley House. When the Wilcox family settled on the first Watchung Mountain in the, on the second Watchung Mountain in the area that is just upstream from the Deserted Village. And remember, I told you about the Wilcox family building their sawmill. At the same time, their in-laws settled on the first Watchung Mountain in the area that is close to what is now the Trailside Nature and Science Center. And in fact, it is what is the current Scout camping area. Peter Wilcox's wife was Phoebe Badgley Wilcox. She was one of 6 children. Of the other 5, one settled down in Elizabeth, but the other 4 came up here, and they had a house along the trail that we're going to talk about on our next stop. But this was their house. It may have been built as early as the early 1700s. Today, it is the Scout camping area. You see these pavilions and a shelter, wide open activity areas, and there are 4 campsites around the outside of it. But here is the building as it looked probably in the 1940s. In 1907, somebody by the name of Arthur Ayres bought the property where the Badgley House is and picked the house up and moved it about 250 feet back and set it up onto a higher foundation and started to use it as a stable. And he built a new, well, actually, he didn't build a new house on the original foundation. He moved the house from down along Route 22, if you know where the borough of Mountainside has its historic house, the Hetfield House. Just between there and Route 22 was a house that he moved up and set on that other foundation, and it was later torn down, but you could still see the depression of the foundation in the field. But over time, the area around this grew up into a business with glass houses, presumably growing flowers and other plants, and the old Badgley House became a riding stable. In later years, it became a maintenance garage for the people who maintained the county park system. So in the 1980s, when I started working at Trailside in 1982, this is where our maintenance crew worked out of until June of 1984, when an arsonist set fire to the building and burned what was arguably one of the oldest houses in Union County to the ground. You heard that I have an educational background in archaeology. I actually did the archaeological salvage work on this building. Most of what I came up with was just a 5-gallon bucket of nails because everything else was so thoroughly burned. But I was able to salvage a couple of timbers that had not completely burned, where you could see how the pieces were fit together with mortise and tenon with wooden pins through them. And they became part of an exhibit we had at the Trailside Nature and Science Center. The nails are an interesting story, and you can see some of them in the visitor center at the Deserted Village if you go into our general store. Back in the 1700s, screws were very difficult to get. Nails were a lot easier to get. If you put up a door with a hinge and you nailed that hinge on, it would quickly work itself loose. The weight of the door would pull the nail out. So instead, you would get nails that were much longer than the wood that you were driving it into, so that it went all the way through the wood, and you would bend it over on the other side, okay, clinching the nail on the inside so it couldn't pull out. That's called making it dead, hence the expression, dead as a doornail. I'll have to join your humor committee. Okay, and our final stop as we head back up the road from the scout camping area to the parking lot at the Trailside Nature and Science Center is the road from Westfield to New Providence. This is a road that literally went from Westfield to New Providence back in the 1700s, but prior to that had been a Native American path called the Monopanoc Indian Trail, and it probably was there because along it was a spring that would have attracted Native Americans. It grew up into a road. It was a colonial era road. George Washington is rumored to have ridden down that road on his way to a meeting at the Sayre House in Springfield, and the Badgleys cited their house where they did because it would be close to that road. On the other side of the Blue Brook, Peter Wilcox built his mill and his house right alongside that road as well. Today, the road still exists in places. In Mountainside, it is still there as New Providence Road. In New Providence, it is called Glenside Road. That's the same road. Prior to the construction of Route 78, Glenside Road used to meet Glenside Avenue directly across from the top of Cataract Hollow Road. And if you turn in on Cataract Hollow Road, and as you're pulling in, look to the left immediately, there's a bridle trail. That trail was the road from Westfield to New Providence. There are other places in the woods where it still exists as a horse trail or hiking trail. There's one area where unfortunately it does not exist at all because it has become so badly eroded, but it was a key location in the park. So, is everybody tired now from our long hike? We're back to our cars, so if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Dan. This is wonderful. I just love the Watchung Reservation. I came to Bell Labs in 1969, which is right at top of the hill.
Mhm.
And then I got into long distance running, and I used to run marathons, believe it or not. And I would practice every lunchtime. I and a bunch of us would go out and we just run around the reservation. It wasn't actually big enough, so we had to do it a couple of times in a lunchtime. You have to put on a lot of miles, but I've been all around. I spent so much time there and I loved it. And it was quiet and secluded, and it broke my heart when they finally started building this highway through the top edge of it. And there were other encroachments, like for instance, they built this Nike missile site in the middle of it, which is another whole chapter. And but anyway, I didn't know the history. I knew the town was called Feltville, and I knew there was a mill there. So I always used to think that it was fabric that they made and felt hats. I always
Right.
used to think it was, and of course it was a deserted village, so that is kind of spooky, and it made me think of the Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland. So I just assumed that the Mad Hatter lived in that town.
Okay. Now, the interesting thing though is that a lot of people make that mistake. They think it was a mill that made felt. No, it was named after David Felt. However, at the far western end of the Watchung Reservation, actually just outside of the park, where Diamond Hill Road, which becomes the other New Providence Road in Watchung, goes down and meets Baltusrol Road and Park Avenue, and up over Route 22. Right in that corner, there is an old building that is a mill. That was a felt mill. They made felt.
Fascinating talk. My question is the boathouse and the bathhouse. They were there until the 70s. Is that what you said? And what happened? Why did they go away?
They were torn down because they were no longer in use. And, when buildings are not being used, and I've seen this firsthand in the Watchung Reservation, when a building is not used, it decays pretty quickly. I guess they were concerned about kids breaking in and getting hurt and things of that type. I never saw the bathhouse. That probably was torn down much earlier, but the boathouse was still in existence when I was a younger scout in the 1960s, early 70s.
So
In fact, we used to have to walk there from the scout camp Refield around the lake and go over there to get water.
So the park ran those and charged money to people
Yes.
and so forth.
Yes, the park
obviously-
commission ran them.
But people stopped coming apparently. So
As with a lot of other things, there were other fancier attractions to go to, and yeah, it probably just wasn't cost effective anymore.
okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dan. I belong to a hiking group in Morris County.
Okay.
That's just north of here.
Yes.
But we came to Feltville about 5 years ago. You were in the midst of rebuilding everything. But the comment I wanted to make was, in being there and reading about this guy, in the middle of the 1850s, he had 175 people. He gave them a job. He gave them a house. And they had to do a few things, including go to church. So this was in the era of the robber barons and 10-year-olds working in the mines in Pennsylvania. So I just wanted to say it was unusual.
Yes. Yes. He really did seem to be protective of his people. He obviously needed them to work because he had a business to run, but he took care of his people as well.
Yeah, it's easy to get to. They got a parking lot. I think a lot of it's paved down to
Yes, the road-
Feltville, right?
The road's paved. It's
So it's
funny.
easy.
People keep saying, "Oh, you paved the road." The road's been paved as long as I've been there, and I've been there 35 years. It's just that when it wasn't in good condition, people thought it was just gravel. No, it was paved. All right, last question.
Sealy's Pond,
Yes.
is that any connection to Feltville?
So
the factory
Sealy's
there?
Pond is only connected by the fact that it is on the Watchung Reservation property. Mr. Sealy, I think it was William Sealy, he was another businessman similar to Felt. He built an entire mill complex down there. I don't believe he had any residence there for his workers. That he must have just gotten his workers from the area. But his industrial complex there was pretty involved. He actually had a platform, a wooden platform built completely across the Green Brook, which was destroyed, I believe, twice by flooding, and yet he rebuilt it again.
We do have one question online from Don Goldberg.
Yeah, hi. I currently live in California, moved out here about a year ago, but I was back visiting about a week, 2 weeks ago. And I did take a walk through the Deserted Village, as I had many times previously. My question, because we're coming up on Halloween, is that there's a local myth, I think it's known as 13 Bumps. Is that something you're familiar with? And could you comment on it?
Okay, so yeah, that is something that comes up often, and it is the 13 Bumps was not in the Deserted Village. In fact, it wasn't even in the Watchung Reservation. It is in the borough of Watchung. It is Johnson Drive, which goes from Gunpike Road up over the mountain and over to the center of Watchung Borough. The story is that at some point, a bunch of women were rounded up, accused of being witches, were put to death, presumably by hanging, and that they were buried under the road, and that each of their graves is a bump in the road. And that even when the road has been repaved and they work the bumps out, that eventually the bumps come back. Now that is the story. Here's the truth of the matter. I'm not going to say that there weren't witches. I'm not going to say they weren't buried under that road. But if they are, somebody would have found them by now, because last year there was a documentary produced by some company working for Hulu, and I spent several days with them. It was actually investigating the death, possible murder of Jeanette Tapama, a 16-year-old girl from Springfield, which was thought to be related to witchcraft and Satanism, which brought them to the 13 Bumps. So we went to the 13 Bumps. And the first thing I noticed is that there are sewer lines and gas lines and water lines that run down Johnson Drive. Certainly, in the course of digging those utility lines, somebody would have hit a witch by now. Secondly, as we drove that road from end to end and back again, I never felt a bump other than a manhole cover. So the 13 Bumps is an interesting story, but apparently just a story. And again, on a table in the back should be 3 different pamphlets that are available to you. One is the map and brochure about the Watchung Reservation History Trail. One is a guided walking tour of the Deserted Village. It's a 1-mile walk. It's basically half a mile in, half a mile out. But again, you can do it from your armchair at home, just reading the entire story of the history of the Deserted Village. And the third is, I forget the actual name, but Union County through the years. It's a compilation of many of the important historic sites in Union County and telling you about what occurred at each of those sites.
Roger, please come up and thank our speaker.
You're going to recognize this.
Yeah.
It's our certificate of appreciation. You'll notice the orchid, which I believe symbolizes the formation of the Summit Old Guard in Summit. And we do have the Summit Old Guard salute.
Thank you very much. I'm going to